Thanks everyone for joining us as we discuss how to move towards a just transition. My name is David Tomasi and I am the leader of More Global Energy, Mining and Renewable Sector Group. If we wish to move towards a just transition, we need to focus on the transition piece itself and recognise the lead times involved. But how do we cope as there is no obvious silver bullet? And given the challenges we face to both the supply and pricing of the more traditional forms of energy. If nothing else, recent global events have further emphasised our present reliance upon them. Our session hopes to provide a little more information about the transition and what it entails. Joining me are three experts from around the globe. Mark Stewart, who joins us from our Moore firm in Scotland. David Haboubi of SNC Lavalin, and Amy Julian from our Moore firm in St. Louis, USA. Mark will provide an overview into the present state of renewables, in particular wind, with David providing an update on an often overlooked and maligned nuclear energy segment of the market. Amy will then provide some insight into how the transition is impacting on manufacturing enterprises, as well as both the challenges and the choices they are facing. Mark, we will start with you. The green agenda needs the right political framework to drive it. What are your experiences in this regard?
Thank you, David. The backdrop to the sector ambition in the UK and Scotland is set by several policy directives set by the UK government around net zero strategy, Build Back Greener, the 10-point bullet plan for a green industrial revolution, the energy white paper powering our net zero future, and Scotland's national strategy for economic transformation, which places decarbonisation across all of businesses and industry at the heart of this vibrant sector in which we operate. The levelling up agenda, together with a just and fair transition, will ensure, in theory anyway, that everybody benefits from the drive to net zero and that nobody is left behind on the transition, particularly from a heavily oil and gas dependent economy in the north of Scotland to a renewable-led economy. In the wake of the energy crisis caused by the Ukrainian conflict, the UK government recently issued a new energy security strategy policy, which is predicated on securing a flow of energy that is affordable, clean, and above all secure. This will be driven by a combination of renewable energy, increased use of nuclear, a huge uptake in hydrogen driven by the offshore wind market, and continued exploitation of the North Sea oil and gas in the short term, which continues to cause controversy in the UK in terms of the net zero ambition, but it does address the issue of security of supply. However, notwithstanding the political support and directives, critics say the level of deployment continues to fall short of where it needs to be to reach net zero by 2050 in the UK, 2045 in Scotland. Indeed, the recent Stark IPCC report states that all sectors across the economy need to at least halve their emissions by 2030, with many scientists commentating that this is just not achievable. So in summary, David, I think the framework is there, the policy directives are there. We just need to speed up the pace of delivery to get the deals done.
Thanks, Mark. Now for the ever-important question of funding. Is there enough money to fund this drive to net zero?
David, there is no doubt that there is sufficient capital in circulation. You may recall at COP26 in Glasgow in November last year, there was talk of around $14 trillion of capital in circulation to fund the net zero agenda globally. But I don't think the issue is really the amount of capital available, it's how quickly it can be deployed, which I think links back to the previous point I made around the speed of delivery of transactions and deal flow. I think the problem is how do you take the global capital ambition and turn that into international, national, and then local commitments so that entrepreneurs, developers, and those on the ground have access to the funds when they need it. I believe that we need more risk capital to enable new technologies and new processes to come to market, which can work with existing proven technologies to deliver that ambition. In terms of availability of green finance and who can access it, I also think that COP26 has the ability to be the COP of change, given the direct linkage between the availability of global finance to demonstrable climate change and ESG strategies by businesses across the globe. The focus initially is going to be on the larger listed entities, but enhanced climate reporting is on its way for the mid-market in the next few years. In theory, for those not on a net zero journey and those not taking accountability for Scope 3 emissions in their supply chain, the funding tap should be turned off. These businesses will find it hard to attract and retain talent, will find it hard to get on tender lists for new businesses, and will generally be regarded as businesses with whom not to do business. So I think, in summary, the capital is there. We need to find quicker and more expeditious routes to market to unlock it.
Thanks, Mark. Again, it's all about the transition and that transition piece and how we manage it, which is what we are looking at today. So being in Scotland and having a lot to do with wind, how do you see the offshore wind market helping with the wider decarbonisation agenda?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. And in Scotland, we recently concluded a ScotWind leasing round, which saw 17 consortia wind concessions around the north, northeast, and northwest of Scotland, which will deliver around 25 gigawatts of offshore wind, of which 2/3 will be floating, which clearly allows us access to deeper waters. Crown Estate Scotland has further announced earlier this year the proposed details of its innovation and targeted oil and gas offshore wind leasing process. And this is going to be very exciting because it will allow developers to apply for the rights to build smaller scale, innovative offshore wind projects, which are going to be connected to the oil and gas infrastructure to provide electricity to decarbonize the North Sea oil and gas exploration, which I think is a terrific initiative. So we will see proliferation of offshore wind generation, which can be used as a catalyst to create green hydrogen. And that's really where we see the excitement coming in the industry, to create green hydrogen, which then can drive the wider decarbonisation agenda across many aspects of the business community. Much of the renewable energy generated will be used to generate green hydrogen, which can be used to decarbonise shipping, aviation, transports, and other parts of the economy which at the moment are struggling to really make any inroads into their green targets. From a wider UK perspective, the offshore leasing round 4 is to deliver something like around 8 gigawatts of power in UK waters. And we can see this initiative being expanded across the European waters. And I think floating wind in particular, where you have access to deep water territories, can be a real catalyst for change going forward, David. So very exciting developments in Scotland, leading the way on offshore wind to generate green hydrogen.
Thanks, Mark. Some wonderful insight there, and particularly what is particular interest to me is how we can utilise those more known renewable energy sources to help produce the green hydrogen that we're all trying to transition to. So some very interesting insights indeed. We'll now turn to David Abubi from SNC Lavalin. As I mentioned earlier, the nuclear industry is much maligned, with technological advances overlooked, and we see it becoming an integral part of the narrative again, particularly as we aim towards net zero. David, what developments are you able to tell us about the technology, particularly given its less than favourable history?
Yeah, I think Nuclear has come a long way in the last kind of 10, 20 years. The nuclear industry right now globally is absolutely flying. There is a shortage of nuclear capability globally, and more countries are looking to nuclear. Now, obviously, people are aware of the kind of large scale, gigawatt scale reactors that are being constructed and operating, and they've all been evolved over the last kind of 10, 15 years, particularly post Fukushima, just to absolutely maximize safety and also minimize the waste and radioactive waste legacy of these large units, which is something that wasn't thought about when they were first built, maybe in the 50s and 60s. So they are now designed with decommissioning and waste management in mind. In fact, they actually form part of the operating license that these things can safely be decommissioned. So we know about the large scale reactors. They are being involved. They are being constructed. People obviously hear about. You may have heard about small modular or advanced modular reactors, which 10 years ago people might have said was a pipe dream. But actually, there are probably 40 or 50 companies developing these smaller scale reactors. These range maybe between 50 megawatts up to maybe 500 megawatts in output. And there's a real race to get the first one of these on the electrical bars. There's probably a front runner of maybe 4 or 5 technologies that I think will become constructed within the next kind of 5 years and be commercially available maybe within 10 years. Beyond that, there are future advances in type of technology, such as high temperature reactors. I think that's probably 10 to 12 years away. And of course, we hear about fusion technology, which is probably 20 years away, but that's yet to be proven to be commercially viable.
Thanks, David. So, how do you see it fitting into the whole green energy discussion? Is it solely a baseload solution, or does it cater best towards specific energy requirements? Or perhaps it's a combination of both?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think nuclear is firmly in the green energy mix. I think even Europe has classified nuclear as green finally, which is fantastic news to hear. Nuclear per kilowatt hour of generated generates about a quarter of the CO2 than PV solar does. So it really is green. And in terms of baseload power, yes, I mean that is ultimately what nuclear was designed for. These units are designed to sit there and generate electricity 24/7 for 18 months continuously until it's refueling outages. Now, having said that, future reactor designs are looking at being able to provide more flexible output responses that can kind of flex as the grid requirements change to provide that kind of more of a peaking output. But I think that's still a few years away from becoming commercially available. And then obviously people think of nuclear as just providing pure power to the grid, but actually countries are now thinking about what else could nuclear be used for. Future high temperature reactors could be used to produce hydrogen. The power could be used directly for other processes such as steel production or desalination. So although traditionally it is used for power, it is not limited to pure power, and there are certain other hybrids, as you said, which nuclear could be used for if thought about in the right way.
Yes, very interesting again. So, given what we now know about how it needs to be managed, would you say that nuclear is a silver bullet or only part of the solution?
Look, I'm a nuclear guy, but I'm not going to push the idea that nuclear is the solution in every single country to get baseload green energy, because I don't believe that's the case. I think there are some countries that it's absolutely suited to more, particularly countries that have got the ability to raise that kind of upfront capex, because they are quite upfront capex heavy, these units, although the lifetime of those units are 80 years. I think countries with the right grid infrastructure, countries that have already had some kind of nuclear infrastructure or a regulator, because the overall setup costs of the overall industry shouldn't be underestimated. These things take years to develop. So there are countries that I think it works, and there are countries that I think, you know what, nuclear probably isn't the right answer. You've got enough renewable natural resources to be able to use to provide baseload power. Your grid infrastructure isn't strong enough. It's going to probably take you longer and cost you more to upgrade your grid to be able to take these massive units. So I think there are countries that need it. There are countries that it works for technically and economically, and there are countries that probably need to, if they really want to go nuclear, they probably need to wait until possibly the small modular reactors are commercially available, a bit more competitive, and could be integrated into their grid a lot more easily.
Thanks, David. Certainly food for thought. Last but not least, we turn to Amy to provide some perspective from manufacturers and industry. Amy, how do you see organisations implement and manage a change to cleaner energy sources?
Thanks, David. So manufacturing is responsible for over half the world's energy consumption. So we do see a great level of interest in starting to make this shift, even without some of the grid level changes that are going on. Additionally, I think you mentioned it earlier, power disruptions and power supply have become a really big issue for a number of manufacturers. So diversifying that supply base, whether it's because of energy or because some of the inputs to the process, are going to be critical for manufacturers across the globe. So we see organizations taking a number of approaches. There's really kind of three core areas to explore. One is around their core operations. Second one is around their facilities. And the third one is just an overall sourcing strategy that they can apply as they move forward. So for the largest energy intensive manufacturers, the shift is really challenging. These companies are going to rely on the local grid. And of course, depending on the geography, that's going to create its own problems. If they're trying to electrify their core operations, that may end up just pulling from the grid, which at least here in St. Louis is coal-based. So it doesn't fully enable that transition without the grid changing as well. But you can look at operational efficiency plays. There's a lot of CapEx investments that could decrease the total usage of energy in the operations, and really looking at that planning and partnering up and down the supply chain for critical inputs and maximize the supply chain runs. This isn't new. A lot of manufacturers look on this on a routine basis, but with that renewed focus and the ability to bring in energy forecast, that's going to be critical to changing their overall footprint. Becoming partners with different energy providers is an option. Some larger companies we see are seeking third-party investors to help build facilities that enable hydro or solar power to be available directly to the facility, or at least help them offset their total carbon footprint. For smaller manufacturers, that's actually going to be easier to unlock. It's much easier to install, say, a solar panel on a local manufacturing site or a local brewery than it is for a large brewer to replace their total energy usage. So really diversifying that energy base can be another step for these large manufacturers. Even replacing that 20% of the total energy needs with a greener option is going to make a difference. So aside from the core operational efficiencies, there's going to be a couple of quick ways to start transitioning around the facilities usage. So in a facilities organization, you want to look at overall systems like HVAC, whether that's energy efficient and using good refrigerant types, really looking at technology to optimize the electricity usage, such as off-peak times, replacing lighting, and managing that overall transportation fleet. So these are some things that might be a little easier to do than replacing the overall core processes. Finally, really defining that procurement strategy for energy is a key next steps. So find that partnership, run an RFP with maybe 100% renewable energy sources, and see where that gets you in terms of total energy pieces. This is going to work best in deregulated market, where you can find that auction strategy and bring partners to the table. But we have seen a lot of success from the manufacturers that we work with. So those are a couple of ways that we see people actually getting started to implement this shift.
Okay, thanks, Amy. You've clearly outlined some actions organisations can also take to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels in what you've just said there as well. So how do you see this shift impacting suppliers? Will costs rise as a result whilst we're in this transition period, do you think? And if so, will there have to be some sort of acknowledgement from both sides of the both the consumer and the supplier for this transition to work smoothly?
Let's see. All right, so the costs are going to be really challenging to assess the impacts down the road. We know that there's a lot of volatility in the price of energy markets today. And there's a lot of reason to believe that the costs are going to come down. So we see cost of solar panels having been reduced. The cost of batteries to store green energy has come down about 85%. So it's a lot more cost effective to store green energy on site than it has been in the past. This may ultimately reduce the exposure to the variable pricing that we see in energy markets today and help keep those costs in check over the long term. What we do see, though, is there's uncertainty about how exactly those cost impacts are going to come through, and that might be creating hesitation to invest in different energy solutions. So what we recommend is really looking at the total cost structure. So where are you seeing the energy usage today in an organization? And then exploring what that return on sustainable investment will be. It's oftentimes not as straightforward as other types of capital investments that companies might make, but it is entirely impossible to quantify that and show how that's going to impact the total cost structure of any given manufacturer. Additionally, I would say this is not a single entity issue. So up and down the supply chain, it's going to be critical to understand the energy usage coming into your facility as well as going out of the facility. We see that the impact of the supply chain overall is about 11 times the impact of any single manufacturing site. So looking at the overall supplier footprint and how the different sources of supply access or receive access to your organization is also critical. So we are also seeing growing interest in supply footprint diversification. This type of initiative is often not fast to implement, but it can have significant benefits in terms of supply assurance, reduce risk, and reduce cost overall. It also is just going to be a new opportunity to find sources that can meet those green energy initiatives that line up with the organizational strategy. In the past, we saw a single source of supply, oftentimes in low-cost countries. We're now seeing a shift where the supplier base is at least diversifying. So having a second source of supply that is maybe near shore reduces the total transportation cost for your inbound supply chain, as well as reduces the risk of having a single source due to the political instability that we have seen of late is going to be a huge advantage to different organizations and help keep those costs overall in check. So there's a couple of ways, still too early to say exactly what the cost impact is going to be, but there's strong reason to believe it will not be a significant impact.
Thanks, Amy. You've certainly provided some real insight into the difficulties that we all face with this transition, as did the previous panelists as well. And I think some of the events or the COVID pandemic has definitely showed or exposed some of the supply chain risks, and more recent times some of the geopolitical risks that we do face throughout all our manufacturing and everyday lives. So it's important that we understand how energy and our energy mix impacts that as well. So that concludes our session. So hopefully we've been able to provide some further insight into the transition to net zero for everyone who has been listening. Thanks to all of the panelists, and thank you for tuning in. From More Global, until next time, We wish you all farewell and happy transitioning.